Have you ever felt overwhelmed by challenges? Whether it's personal struggles, conflicts, or even injustices that seem to come from nowhere? It's like you're surrounded by an invisible storm, and no matter how hard you try, you can't find a way out. In these times, Psalm chapter 35 is a powerful prayer that can serve as your spiritual anchor. It offers divine protection, justice, and peace when everything seems to be falling apart. This psalm isn't just words on a page, it's a lifeline. Calling on God to fight your battles, shield you from harm, and deliver you from the storm. It's a prayer for those overwhelming moments, the ones when you feel alone, attacked, or outnumbered. Psalm chapter 35 reminds us that God is always with us, fighting for us, even when we can't see or understand His plan. It's not just a prayer, it's a declaration of trust in God's unshakable power. Imagine you're caught in the middle of a fierce storm. The wind is howling, the rain is pouring down, and no matter which direction you turn, you feel lost and helpless. It's the kind of storm that makes you wonder if you'll ever make it out. In that moment, Psalm chapter 35 is like a lifeline that God throws to you, pulling you from the chaos and leading you towards safety. You might not have the strength to fight the storm on your own, but with God's help, you don't have to. Think back to the story of David and Goliath. David, a young shepherd boy, was smaller and weaker than the mighty warrior Goliath. To the world, the odds were stacked against David, but what David had, that Goliath did not, was faith in God. When he stepped onto the battlefield, it wasn't his size or strength that mattered, it was God's power behind him. David called upon God for help, and with one simple stone, God brought down the giant. Psalm chapter 35 is exactly like that. It's a prayer that calls on God to fight your battles for you when you feel powerless. It asks for divine protection when enemies are surrounding you, just as David asked for God's help to face Goliath. When the world seems against you, this psalm is your reminder that God is there, fighting for you. He's not just watching from afar, He's actively involved in the fight. Think about the times in your own life when you felt overwhelmed, outnumbered, or betrayed. Maybe it's a difficult situation at work, a painful relationship, or a personal struggle you've been carrying for years. In those moments, Psalm chapter 35 invites you to call upon God's power. You don't need to navigate the storm alone. Just as David didn't face Goliath without God's help, you don't have to face your giants without God's strength. God's protection is a shield, a covering over your life, just like how a knight is fully armored before heading into battle. Psalm chapter 35 equips you with the armor of faith and trust in God's justice. It doesn't matter how big your battle is, whether it's an emotional storm, a health challenge, or a conflict with others. Psalm chapter 35 serves as a powerful reminder that God is your shield. He fights your battles so you can stand tall, knowing that victory is His to give. And in those moments of hardship, remember, Psalm chapter 35 isn't just a cry for help. It's a reminder that God's love and power are greater than anything we face. It's the first step in calling on God's strength to carry you through any storm. The psalm portrays God as a mighty shield, standing guard against harm, injustice, and any form of adversity. This protection is not just a passive form of defense, it is an active, intentional force that stands between you and danger. Think of it like having a superhero with an impenetrable shield, ready to stand in the way of any attack. In this way, Psalm chapter 35 teaches us to trust in God's protection, believing that He is always by our side, guarding us from harm, just as a shield would protect a warrior in battle. This section emphasizes that no matter how dire the situation may seem, God is ever present as a shield, guarding us from both visible and invisible dangers. The psalm is not just about asking for help, it's about recognizing that God is constantly working on our behalf to keep us safe from harm. The Bible uses several powerful examples of how God has protected His people throughout history. And these stories serve as a reminder that His protection is constant and unyielding. Let's think about Noah and the ark. At that time, the world was filled with corruption, violence, and sin, and God decided to flood the earth to start anew. However, Noah was different. He was a righteous man who trusted God, and because of his faith, God instructed him to build an ark to save his family and the animals from the coming flood, while the rest of the world was swept away by the floodwaters. Noah and his family were kept safe in the ark. This story is a beautiful example of how God's protection works. When the storm of life feels like it's about to overwhelm you, God acts as your ark, your shield, ensuring that you stay safe from the dangers around you. Just as God protected Noah during the Great Flood, Psalm chapter 35 reminds us that God's protection is available for us today. Think about the storms in your own life, times when you felt overwhelmed, vulnerable, or threatened. Maybe it was a personal crisis or a situation that seemed out of control. In those moments, Psalm chapter 35 calls on God to act as a shield, guarding you from harm just as he shielded Noah from the flood. Consider this. When Noah was building the ark, it wasn't just a boat, it was God's provision, his shield to protect Noah and his family from disaster. Likewise, when you pray Psalm chapter 35, you are inviting God to act as that same shield over your life. It's more than just words, it's an acknowledgement that God has the power to protect you from forces you can't even see. Even when the world seems to be falling apart, just like in Noah's time, God is ready to protect you, ensuring you don't face life's challenges alone. When you pray Psalm chapter 35, think of God's protection as an unbreakable shield surrounding you. Picture God standing before you, his armor shining bright, pushing back the forces of darkness that try to come against you. This is the imagery the psalm invokes, God standing as a defender, blocking every attack and keeping you safe. Whether it's the storms of life, the attacks from those who wish you harm, or the invisible battles you can't see, Psalm chapter 35 is your invitation to call on God to shield you just as he shielded Noah, keeping you safe through any storm that comes your way. In your own life, trust that no matter what you face, God's shield of protection is there. Whether you're walking through troubled times, facing opposition, or dealing with personal struggles, God's promise is that he will be your defender, keeping you safe under his mighty protection. Just like Noah, who was safe in the ark because of his faith, you too are safe in God's protection when you trust in him with your whole heart. The psalm is a plea for God to take action against those who wrong us, asking that the unjust be confused, defeated, and held accountable for their actions. It's not simply about asking God to fight our battles, but trusting in his ability to deliver justice. This section explores the truth that while evil may seem to prosper in the moment, in the end, it will always be defeated by God's righteous power. The psalm reassures us that God will not allow injustice to prevail and that those who seek to harm us will ultimately face the consequences of their actions. The psalm teaches us that, while we might not always see it immediately, God is working behind the scenes, making sure that wrongdoers do not escape the consequences of their actions. This part of the video focuses on the concept that God's justice is sure and will always win, no matter how unfair things may seem. One of the most powerful examples of God's justice comes from the story of Haman in the book of Esther. Haman, a high-ranking official in the Persian Empire, harbored a deep hatred for the Jewish people, especially Mordecai, a Jewish man who refused to bow to him. Driven by pride and hatred, Haman devised a plot to have all the Jews in Persia killed. He built a gallows specifically to hang Mordecai. But little did he know, God had a much different plan in mind. As Haman's plot was set in motion, God's justice began to unfold. Through a series of divine events, the king's favor shifted away from Haman, and his evil plans were exposed. Ultimately, it was Haman who was hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. God's justice prevailed, and Haman, who had planned harm for others, found himself caught in his own trap. Psalm chapter 35 reflects the same principle of divine justice. When we face people who wrong us, whether through deceit, injustice, or ill intentions, it's easy to feel helpless or frustrated. However, Psalm chapter 35 reminds us that we don't need to take matters into our own hands. We are called to trust in God's justice, just as he turned the tables on Haman and exposed his wickedness. God promises that he will ensure that those who do wrong will eventually be held accountable. Think about the moments when you faced injustice or felt wronged by others. Perhaps someone lied about you, betrayed your trust, or tried to harm you for no reason. Psalm chapter 35 encourages you to lift those burdens up to God, knowing that he sees everything. It assures us that, even when it seems like the wicked prosper or escape punishment, God's justice is at work. He will not allow those who sow evil to escape unscathed. This is not just about personal vindication, it's about trusting that God is the ultimate judge. It's His job to right the wrongs, and He will do it in His time. When we allow God to handle the consequences, we free ourselves from bitterness and anger. Instead of seeking revenge, Psalm chapter 35 teaches us to trust that God will deal with the unjust. Just as He did with Haman, He will expose their wrongdoings, and His justice will always prevail. In your own life, when you face unfairness, remember that God's justice is always at work. Psalm chapter 35 is a prayer of reassurance, reminding us that no matter how dark or unfair things may seem, God will always defend the righteous and bring justice to those who try to harm us. Just as Haman's evil was revealed and brought to an end, so too will God bring justice in your life. Trust in His timing, knowing that He will make things right, just as He always has throughout history. Psalm chapter 35 speaks powerfully about how God steps in to stop those who pursue us with evil, and how His angels intervene on our behalf. When we are at our lowest and feel like there's no way out, God has the ability to create paths where none seem to exist. The psalm reassures us that we don't have to face life's trials alone. God is always actively working on our behalf, making a way even when we can't see one. Through His intervention, God shows us that He is not just an observer but an active participant in our lives, leading us through even the darkest of times. This section emphasizes the importance of trusting in God's intervention. The story of Moses and the Israelites is a perfect example of how God can turn impossible situations into testimonies of His power. The psalm encourages us to have faith in God's ability to deliver us. Even when the odds seem impossible, it reminds us that God is always ready to step in and provide a way. No matter how hopeless our circumstances might appear, one of the most powerful examples of divine intervention in the Bible is the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. After years of slavery, God finally delivered His people, leading them to freedom. But as they neared the Red Sea, an enormous obstacle loomed before them. The sea was vast, and behind them, the Egyptian army was in hot pursuit, bent on recapturing the Israelites and returning them to slavery. The people were trapped, with nowhere to go. Imagine the panic. The Israelites were stuck between the sea and the Egyptian army, seemingly without a way out. They must have felt hopeless, trapped in a situation with no escape. But that's when God intervened in a miraculous way. Moses, with unwavering faith, stretched out his hand over the sea as God had instructed him, and the waters parted, creating a dry path right through the middle of the Red Sea. The Israelites were able to walk through to safety, while the Egyptian army, in pursuit, was swallowed by the waters when the sea closed back in. This divine intervention wasn't just a random act, it was a testament to God's power and faithfulness. When the Israelites thought they had no options left, when they felt cornered and defeated, God made a way where there seemed to be none. This act of divine intervention not only saved the lives of the Israelites but also solidified their faith in God as their ultimate protector and deliverer. Now, think about the Red Seas in your own life. Perhaps you are facing a difficult decision, a personal crisis, or a situation that feels impossible to overcome. You may feel like there's no way out, like you are trapped between your own personal Red Sea and the enemy closing in behind you. In those moments, Psalm chapter 35 serves as a powerful reminder that just as God parted the Red Sea for Moses and the Israelites, He can part the obstacles in your life too. Even when things seem impossible, God is actively working on your behalf to provide a way forward. Just like Moses trusted in God's plan, we are encouraged to trust that God will make a way for us. Even when we can't see it, the Israelites had no idea how God would save them, but they followed Moses' lead in faith, and God did the rest. Sometimes, when we face our own Red Seas, we might not know how God will provide, but trusting that He will make a way is where the miracle begins. Psalm chapter 35 reminds us that we are never alone in our struggles. When you feel trapped, know that God is always with you, preparing a way for you, just as He did for Moses and the Israelites. Even when it feels like there is no way forward, remember that God is a God of the impossible. He steps in when we are at our lowest, providing a way out and bringing us to safety. This divine intervention is a powerful tool to rely on when we trust in God's ability to create a path where none exists. We walk forward in faith, knowing that He is guiding us every step of the way. Just as the Israelites crossed the Red Sea to freedom, Psalm chapter 35 assures us that God is paving the way for us to move forward. No matter the obstacles ahead, trust in God's intervention, and you will see how He moves mountains and parts seas for you. Psalm chapter 35 not only serves as a prayer for divine intervention, but also as a reminder that when God steps in and answers our prayers, it is essential to show gratitude. The psalm encourages us to recognize that we are never truly alone and that God is always ready and willing to help us when we call upon Him. However, the psalm also reminds us that it is equally important to acknowledge God's greatness, to thank Him openly, and to celebrate His mercy and power when He comes through for us. This section emphasizes that gratitude is a vital part of our relationship with God when we ask for His help. We must also make sure to thank Him when He answers. A beautiful illustration of gratitude and God's compassionate love can be found in the parable of the prodigal son. In this story, a young man asks for his inheritance early, leaves his family, and squanders his wealth in reckless living. He eventually finds himself destitute and decides to return home, hoping to be treated as a servant, since he feels unworthy to be called a son after his mistakes. But when his father sees him from a distance, he runs to embrace him, welcoming him back with open arms. Not only is the son forgiven, but he is celebrated. His father orders a feast to be prepared in his honor, declaring that, "This son of mine was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found." This story is a profound reflection of God's love and mercy toward us. Just as the prodigal son was welcomed back with compassion and celebration, when we come to God in prayer, asking for help, He responds with love, forgiveness, and grace, no matter how far we have strayed or how undeserving we may feel. God is always ready to extend His mercy to us. When we pray Psalm chapter 35, we are essentially calling out to God for help in times of need, whether we are facing struggles, feeling alone, or dealing with injustice. God is always ready to answer. But just as the prodigal son's return was met with celebration, we too must respond with gratitude when God answers our prayers. It is not enough to simply ask for help. We must also honor God with thanksgiving. Gratitude isn't just about saying, "thank you," in passing. It's about acknowledging that God's intervention in our lives is a gift. Just as the father in the parable rejoiced at his son's return, we too should rejoice when God's mercy and protection are extended to us. When God comes through for us, whether through protection, provision, or guidance, we must express our gratitude openly, both in prayer and in action. This means sharing our gratitude with others, testifying to God's goodness, and celebrating His blessings with joy. Think about a time in your own life when God answered a prayer. Whether big or small, how did you respond? Did you express your gratitude? Psalm chapter 35 teaches us that when we ask for God's help, we must also promise to give thanks for His intervention. The act of thanking God isn't just a formality, it's a crucial part of recognizing His greatness and our dependence on Him. By thanking God openly, we acknowledge that He is the source of all good things in our lives. Just like the prodigal son's story, when God answers our prayers, He doesn't just offer help, He offers love, grace, and restoration, and in return, we are called to respond with joy, appreciation, and humility. When God moves in our lives, we should celebrate His goodness, not just in private prayers but by publicly sharing our gratitude and rejoicing in His merciful acts. Psalm chapter 35 is a reminder that God is not only our protector and deliverer but also our Father who loves us unconditionally. When we come to Him in times of need, we can be assured that He will respond. But in the same breath, we must remember to respond with thankfulness, acknowledging His faithfulness and celebrating the mercy He pours into our lives. Just like the prodigal son, we should be ready to return to God with gratitude, recognizing the great gift of His love and grace. Psalm chapter 35 is a prayer that teaches us to trust that God is with us through every storm and challenge we face. It encourages us to hold on to the belief that God's protection and justice will ultimately manifest in our lives. No matter how dark the circumstances may seem, As we navigate through trials, it's important to remember that our faith in God will lead us to victory. This section urges viewers to keep praying with faith, trusting that, through His strength and guidance, we will experience God's ultimate victory in the end. To illustrate the power of trusting in God's plan, consider the story of Joseph from the Bible. Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and he was his father's favorite, which made his brothers incredibly jealous. In a moment of overwhelming bitterness, his brothers betrayed him, throwing him into a pit and selling him into slavery. Imagine the depth of betrayal and hopelessness Joseph must have felt. His own flesh and blood, the people he loved and trusted, had sold him out for their own jealousy. Joseph's journey was far from easy. He went from being a slave in Egypt to being wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit, and then thrown into prison. It must have seemed like his dreams, his hopes, and his future were shattered beyond repair. But despite everything, his brothers' betrayal, the false accusations, the time in prison, Joseph trusted that God had a bigger plan for his life. Even when his circumstances seemed impossible, Joseph's faith never wavered. He believed that God was working behind the scenes, guiding him toward a greater purpose. And then, in a twist that could only be orchestrated by God, Joseph's life took an incredible turn. He was brought out of prison and rose to power in Egypt, becoming second in command only to Pharaoh himself. His wisdom and leadership not only saved Egypt from famine but also brought his brothers, who had betrayed him, back into his life. Joseph was able to forgive them and help them in their time of need. Joseph's story is a powerful example of how, even when life seems at its darkest and we face the deepest betrayals, God is always working on something greater. Joseph could have allowed his circumstances to define him, but instead, he chose to trust in God's plan. He held on to his faith, and in the end, he saw God's purpose fulfilled in ways he couldn't have imagined. Psalm chapter 35 teaches us to hold on to that same faith. Just as Joseph trusted God through his trials, we too must trust that God is working in the background of our lives. Even when we can't see the way forward, even when the road ahead seems filled with obstacles and challenges, God is with us, and He has a purpose for every struggle we face. The psalm encourages us to keep praying, keep trusting, and keep believing that, no matter how difficult life gets, we will experience God's victory. Just as Joseph rose from the pit to a place of power and influence, God will bring us through our trials and into His purpose for our lives. We might not understand the why of our struggles, but we can trust in the how, that God is always with us, guiding us, and that in His perfect timing, His victory will manifest. In your own life, when you face hardships or feel betrayed, remember Joseph's story. Even when it seems like everything is falling apart, trust that God is working on something greater. Keep praying with faith, and believe that His protection, justice, and victory will come. You might not see it now, but God is shaping your story in ways that will ultimately bring glory to His name and lead you to a place of victory, just as He did with Joseph. So, as you continue to face life's trials, take comfort in knowing that, just like Joseph, God is with you through it all. Keep trusting, keep praying, and know that His victory is guaranteed. No matter what you face, you will emerge stronger, wiser, and victorious in God's perfect plan.